A scorched earth policy is a military strategy that involves destroying anything that might be useful to the enemy while advancing through or withdrawing from an area. Specifically, all of the assets that are used or can be used by the enemy are targeted, such as food sources, transportation, communications, industrial resources, and even the people in the area. The practice can be carried out by the military in enemy territory, or in its own home territory. It may overlap with, but is not the same as, punitive destruction of the enemy's resources, which is done for purely strategic, political reasons rather than strategic, operational reasons. A scorched earth policy was famously used by Joseph Stalin against the German army's invasion of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, by William Tecumseh Sherman during his march to the sea in the American Civil War, by Lord Kitchener against the Boers, and by the Russian army during the failed Napoleonic invasion of Russia. The strategy of destroying the food and water supply of the civilian population in an area of conflict has been banned under Article 54 of Protocol I of the 1977 Geneva Conventions. The relevant passage says, "It is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, drinking water installations and supplies, and irrigation works, for the specific purpose of denying them for their sustenance value to the civilian population or to the adverse party, whatever the motive, whether in order to starve out civilians, to cause them to move away, or for any other motive." Ancient times. The Scythians used scorched earth methods against King Darius the Great of Persia. Nomadic herders, the Scythians retreated into the depths of the steppes, destroying food supplies and poisoning wells. As a result, Darius the Great was forced to concede defeat. A large number of his troops died from starvation and dehydration. The Greek general Xenophon records in his Anabasis that the Armenians burned their crops and food supplies as they withdrew before the advance of the 10,000. The Greek mercenary general Memnon suggested to the Persian satraps the use of the scorched earth policy against Alexander as he moved into Asia Minor. He was refused. Roman era. The system of punitive destruction of property and subjugation of people when accompanying a military campaign was known as Vastasia. Two of the first uses of scorched earth recorded both happened in the Gallic Wars. The first was used when the Celtic Helvetii were forced to evacuate their homes in southern Germany and Switzerland due to incursions of unfriendly Germanic tribes to add incentive to the march. The Helvetii destroyed everything they could not bring. After the Helvetii were defeated by a combined Roman-Gallic force, the Helvetii were forced to rebuild themselves on the shattered German and Swiss plains they themselves had destroyed. The second case shows actual military value. During the Great Gallic War, the Gauls under Vercingetorix planned to lure the Roman armies into Gaul and then trap and obliterate them. To this end, they ravaged the countryside of what are now the Benelux countries and France. This did cause immense problems for the Romans, but Roman military triumphs over the Gallic alliance showed that this alone was not enough to save Gaul from subjugation by Rome. During the Second Punic War in 218–202 BC, the Carthaginians used this method selectively while storming through Italy. After the end of the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the Roman Senate also elected to use this method to permanently destroy the Carthaginian capital city, Carthage. The buildings were torn down, their stones scattered so not even rubble remained, and the fields were burned. However, the story that they salted the earth is apocryphal. In the year AD 363, the Emperor Julian's invasion of Sassanid Persia was turned back by a scorched earth policy. The extensive region that lies between the river Tigris and the mountains of Media, was in a very improved state of cultivation. Julian might expect that a conqueror, who possessed the two forcible instruments of persuasion, steel and gold, would easily procure a plentiful subsistence from the fears or avarice of the natives. But, on the approach of the Romans, the rich and smiling prospect was instantly blasted. Wherever they moved, the cattle was driven away, the grass and ripe corn were consumed with fire, and, as soon as the flames had subsided which interrupted the march of Julian, he beheld the melancholy face of a smoking and naked desert. This desperate but effectual method of defense can only be executed by the enthusiasm of a people who prefer their independence to their property, or by the rigor of an arbitrary government, which consults the public safety without submitting to their inclinations the liberty of choice. Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages British monk Gildas, whose 6th century treatise, On the Ruin of Britain, wrote about an earlier invasion, for the fire of vengeance spread from sea to sea, and did not cease, until, destroying the neighbouring towns and lands, it reached the other side of the island. During the Great Viking invasion of England opposed by Alfred the Great and various other Saxon and Welsh rulers, the Viking chieftain Haystein in late summer 893 marched his men to Chester to occupy the ruined Roman fortress there. The refortified fortress should have made an excellent base for raiding northern Mercia, but the Mercians are recorded as having taken the drastic measure of destroying all crops and livestock in the surrounding countryside in order to starve the Danes out. The Danes left Chester next year and marched into Wales. Harrying of the North. In the Harrying of the North, William the Conqueror's solution to stop a rebellion in 1069 was the brutal conquest and subjugation of the north of England. William's men burnt whole villages from the Humber to Tees, and slaughtered the inhabitants. Food stores and livestock were destroyed so that anyone surviving the initial massacre would soon succumb to starvation over the winter. The destruction is depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. The survivors were reduced to cannibalism, with one report stating that the skulls of the dead were cracked open so that the brains could be eaten. Between 100,000 and 150,000 perished, and the area took centuries to recover from the damage. High and late Middle Ages. During the 100 Years' War, both the English and the French conducted chevauchée raids over the enemy territory to damage its infrastructure. Robert the Bruce counselled using these operational methods to hold off the English King Edward's forces when the English invaded Scotland. According to an anonymous 14th-century poem, in strait places Gark keep all store, and burn an ye plain land, and before that they shall pass away in haste, what that they find nothing but waste. This is the counsel and intent of good King Robert's testament. In 1336, the defenders of Palnay in Lithuania set the castle on fire and committed mass suicide in order to make the attacking Teutonic orders victory a costly one. The strategy was widely used in the Romanian principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. Prince Misha I of Wallachia used it against the Ottomans in 1395, and Prince Stephen III of Moldavia scorched the earth in his country as the Ottoman army advanced in 1475 and 1476. A slighting is the deliberate destruction, partial or complete, of a fortification without opposition. Sometimes, such as during the Wars of Scottish Independence and the English Civil War, the intention was to render the structure unusable as a fortress. In England during the Middle Ages, adulterine castles, if captured by the king, would usually be slighted. During the Wars of Scottish Independence, Robert the Bruce adopted a strategy of slighting Scottish castles to prevent him being occupied by the invading English. A strategy of slighting castles in Palestine was also adopted by the Mamelukes in their wars with the Crusaders. Early modern era. Further British use of scorched-earth policies in war was seen during the 16th century in Ireland. where it was used by English commanders such as Walter Devereux and Richard Bingham. Its most infamous use was by Humphrey Gilbert during the wars against the native Irish in Munster in the 1560s and 1570s. Actions which earned the praise of the poet Edmund Spenser in his view of the present state of Ireland in 1596. The Desmond Rebellions are a famous case in Ireland. Much of the province of Munster was laid waste. The poet Edmund Spenser left an account of it in those late wars in Munster, for notwithstanding that the same was a most rich and plentiful country, full of corn and cattle, that he would have thought they could have been able to stand long, yet ere 1 year and a half they were brought to such wretchedness, as that any stony heart would have rued the same. Out of every corner of the wood and glens they came creeping forth upon their hands, for their legs could not bear them. They looked anatomies of death, they spoke like ghosts, crying out of their graves. They did eat of the carrions, happy where they could find them, yea, and one another soon after, insomuch as the very carcasses they spared not to scrape out of their graves, and if they found a plot of watercresses or shamrocks, there they flocked as to a feast for the time, yet not able long to continue therewithal, that in a short space there were none almost left, and a most populous and plentiful country suddenly left void of man or beast. In 1630, Field Marshal General Torquator Conti was in command of imperial forces during the 30 Years' War. Forced to retreat from the advancing Swedish army of King Gustavus Adolphus, Conti ordered his troops to burn houses, destroy villages and generally cause as much harm to property and people as possible. His actions were remembered thus. To revenge himself upon the Duke of Pomerania, the imperial general permitted his troops, upon his retreat, to exercise every barbarity on the unfortunate inhabitants of Pomerania, who had already suffered but too severely from his avarice. On pretense of cutting off the resources of the Swedes, the whole country was laid waste and plundered, and often, when the imperialists were unable any longer to maintain a place, it was laid in ashes, in order to leave the enemy nothing but ruins. During the Great Northern War, Russia scorched earth in the way of Swedish King Charles XII's forces. Wallachian Ottoman Wars in 1462, a massive Ottoman army led by Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia. Vlad the Impaler retreated to Transylvania. During his departure, he conducted scorched earth tactics to ward off Sultan Mehmed II's approach. When the Ottoman forces approached Târgovista, they encountered over 20,000 people impaled by the forces of Vlad the Impaler, creating a forest of dead or dying bodies on stakes. This atrocious, gut-wrenching sight caused Sultan Mehmed II to withdraw from battle and send Radu instead, Vlad's brother, to fight Vlad the Impaler. Great Siege of Malta in early 1565, Grand Master Jean Parassot de Valette ordered the harvesting of all the crops in Malta, including unripened grain, to deprive the Ottomans of any local food supplies since spies had warned of an imminent Ottoman attack. Furthermore, the knights poisoned all wells with bitter herbs and dead animals. The Ottomans arrived on the 18th of May of that year, and the Great Siege of Malta began. The Ottomans managed to capture one fort, but were eventually defeated by the knights, the Maltese militia and a Spanish relief force. Mughal Murata Wars. Shivaji Maharaj had introduced scorched earth tactics known as Ganimi cover. His forces looted traders and businessmen from Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb's empire, and burnt down his cities. But they were strictly ordered not to rape or hurt the innocent civilians, and not to cause any sort of disrespect to any of the religious institutes. Shivaji's son, Sambhaji Maharaj, was detested throughout the Mughal Empire for his scorched earth tactics until he and his men were captured by Mukarrab Khan and his Mughal army, contingent of 25,000. On the 11th of March 1689, a panel of Mughal Qadis indicted and sentenced Sambhaji to death for condoning casual torture, arson, looting, and massacre of the emperor's subjects, but most prominently for giving shelter to Sultan Muhammad Akbar, the fourth son of Aurangzeb, who sought Sambhaji's aid in winning the Mughal throne from his emperor father. Sambhaji was particularly condemned for the 3 days of ravaging committed after the Battle of Burhanpur. In the year 1747, the Marathas, led by Raghoji Bhonsle, began to raid, pillage and annex the territories in Odisha belonging to the Mughal Empire's Nawab of Bengal, Alivadi Khan. The Maratha cavalry numbering 40,000 had sacked the town of Midnapur and set granaries and villages ablaze.